I'm going to pass it over to Miriam and Mansure. Thank you so much for having Rich and Miriam Mansure for presenting the guide.
Thank you, Rie.
Thank you so much, Rie. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Gender Inclusivity in the Workplace Guide. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. We are very excited to introduce you to the practical guide which we have developed as a pilot project. The overall length of this webinar will be 60 minutes. The presentation will take 45 minutes, and we will have 15 minutes for question and answer at the end.
This project is supported by the Pilot Fund for Gender Equality, a collaboration between Community Foundations of Canada and the Equality Fund, with support from the Government of Canada. We would also like to use this opportunity to thank Edmonton Community Foundation, who made this grant available to organizations like us in Edmonton. In addition, we would like to also thank Reach Edmonton for their generous support in hosting this webinar.
We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather today is Treaty 6 territory, traditional homelands for many Indigenous peoples, including Kikwa, Saulteaux, Niitsitapi, Métis, Dene, and Nakota. With this acknowledgement, we pay our respects to the elders, past and present, who call this land home. Who call this land home, and remind all of us gathered here today of the responsibilities we have as treaty people to understand our shared colonial history and work together towards a just future that includes and enriches all people. I'm a newcomer to Canada of German descent and recognize that I'm a settler here on Treaty 6 land.
I would like to take a moment and address my recognition of this land. As an immigrant, I acknowledge my privilege and responsibility to contribute as much as I can to this land and its rich heritage. With regard to the nature of this work, it is specifically important to recognize the rights historically denied to Indigenous peoples and the necessity to practice inclusivity in all areas of our personal and professional lives.
Since its establishment in 1993, the Centre for Race and Culture, or CPRAC for short, formerly known as the Northern Alberta Alliance on Race Relations, has brought together diverse people with an interest in promoting and supporting individual, collective, and systemic change to address discrimination and racism and to encourage intercultural understanding. Taking an intersectional approach, our expertise spans workplace development, community building, research, and education. If you would like to learn more about current events, projects, and activities, please visit our website and sign up for our newsletter. This guide was created by the Center for Race and Culture. Mansour Modaris, who is a consultant at CFAC, has led the project. Miriam Gerber, myself, who is the research coordinator at CFAC, supported the project, and Ali Binabi, CFAC's executive director, oversaw the project as project manager.
You can access this webinar on your mobile phones, tablets, laptops, or desktop computers. If you're using a laptop or desktop computer, as you can see from the slide, on your main screen at the bottom of the page, you will either see a chat icon, or you can find it by clicking on the three dots as shown by the red arrows. If you're using a smartphone, the chat icon will appear on your main screen, again as shown by the red arrow. Depending on what device you're using, you will see a chat box appear on your screens. If you're using the desktop version of Zoom, this box will appear on the right-hand side of your screen. If you're using a phone platform, the screen will change to the chat box as you see from the pictures. You can use this chat box to post your questions and comments throughout the webinar or at the Q&A session. Moreover, you can access links such as the feedback form by opening the chat box at the end or towards the end of our webinar. Throughout the webinar, we'll run some polls as a way to better understand the current level of our audience's familiarity with gender inclusivity topics in the workplace and in their organization. Please feel free to post questions throughout the webinar. We will collect these questions, and we have set aside 15 minutes at the end where we will provide answers. We'll also ask you to submit a feedback form at the end of the webinar, which will be very helpful to us to further improve our services. The overall objective of this webinar is to introduce our Gender Inclusivity in the Workplace Guide. We'll also explain a few key concepts in the context of gender equality and inclusivity, but this is not a webinar on gender inclusivity. While we will give an overview of the content of the guide, we will not go through this guide in every detail. However, after this webinar, you will be able to use this guide effectively in your own organization. And we hope that the tools and recommendations we offer in this guide will assist you in taking steps to facilitate discussions and incorporate more gender inclusive strategies into your organization. Finally, as this guide is a pilot project, your feedback is vital to us, as we are expanding this project to a larger audience and more diverse organizations. The guide will be available as a PDF document, and a recording of this webinar will also be posted on our website.
In this webinar, we will address the following topics. First, we will define what gender inclusivity is and what it is not. We will also discuss why gender inclusivity matters today in our society and for everyone. We will provide an overview of the main topics covered in this resource, discuss discrimination and harassment in the context of the workplace, and finally, we will also give a brief introduction to strategies and practices which are intended to provide a more gender inclusive environment, and how this guide can be used to facilitate the development and incorporation of more gender inclusive strategies in your organization. A CTV News report from April 20th this year found that while Canadian support for the principle of equal rights for women and men is among the highest in the world, in practice, archaic attitudes toward gender roles are still alive and well, both at home and around the globe, a new survey suggests. This survey examined attitudes among Canadians with respect to gender roles. 11% of participants said men should have more right to a job over women at times when work is scarce. 2/3 of participants said that men have more access to higher paying jobs. 22% of participants said that men have more influence over household financial decisions, and 37% of participants said that women exert more control over child-rearing decisions. These results suggest that the issue of equality, much like environmental concerns over the last 20 years, have tended to attract a level of outward public support that can suddenly dissolve when people's economic well-being is under threat. At the same time, the report also indicates that there is still considerable disparity between men and women, both in terms of the workforce as well as in terms of responsibilities in the household and caring for family members. In order to get a better idea of how gender affects us, let's take a look at a current issue. You may have come across news stories about how specific discriminatory attitudes have emerged with respect to COVID-19 and minority groups. In this example, we would like to show how other factors, such as an individual's gender, could affect their vulnerability during this pandemic. While the current COVID-19 pandemic impacts the daily lives of everyone, some people are more impacted than others. This is one current example of how gender directly impacts us economically and with respect to our physical and mental well-being. A CTV report from April 22nd, 2020 found that women are disproportionately bearing the brunt of the current crisis in terms of job losses. In March, women between 25 to 54 years of age lost more than twice as many jobs as men of the same age group. Nearly half of this decrease was among women working part-time, often low-paying jobs in service and care industries. Women overall accounted for 2/3 of total job losses in the country in the month of March, despite making up less than half of the workforce. The reasons? Historically, economic recessions tend to see marked downturn in the manufacturing, construction, and natural resources sectors, which are typically male-dominated. During this pandemic, part-time employees of the service industry are particularly hard hit, and these employees are often women. These jobs have no sick leave or benefits, and employees cannot work remotely. School and daycare closures leave many women to take care of children while juggling work. Between February and March, over 10% of women between the ages of 25 to 54 left the Canadian labour market to care for family. Women represent more than 90% of nurses, 75% of respiratory therapists, and up to 90% of personal support workers, caring for seniors in long-term care home facilities and home care. Women are more likely to hold jobs such as cleaners and grocery store workers and are facing an increased risk of infection due to the essential services they provide. Women's shelters and helplines have been reporting a surge in requests for assistance from domestic violence victims who are spending more time at home with their abusers during self-isolation. It is astonishing to see the gender gap widen to this extent as a result of a pandemic that is supposed to affect everyone. But the question would be, is that effect equal across the gender continuum?
Now that we have looked at the role gender can play during a pandemic in a contemporary example, we'll move to what brought us to developing this guide. We began this project by reviewing the current academic and gray literature and resources on the topic. We realized that some publications are either very academic, and while they provide important information, they do not necessarily offer tangible recommendations for the general public. At the same time, we noticed that other resources focused on one specific population, that is LGBTQ+ or women only. And we found that at times, recommendations only apply to a specific group of employees, mainly management. Based on this, we wanted to develop a resource that would be accessible yet informative. Our goal is to provide real and tangible steps which can be taken by any member of a staff and any organization. We also want to address clearly which steps can be taken by executive and administrative teams to actively contribute to a more inclusive environment. It is also important to us to ensure that this resource addresses and contains information relevant to everyone because gender inclusivity concerns us all. Even though we have diversity and inclusion departments or professionals in most, if not all, organizations, the majority of people are either unaware of or overlook the issues regarding gender identity, the necessity of providing a safe and inclusive space for all staff, and the indispensable role of leadership in incorporating these changes in the work environment. Moreover, the general tendency is that an employee would rarely contact the human resources unless an issue becomes unbearable for fear of getting involved with the legal aspects. Knowledge is power, and our goal in developing this resource has been to provide accessible definitions and examples of the issues that may arise in the workplace and offer practical strategies to prevent conflicts, to deal with issues when they arise, and who to contact for an intervention when necessary.
So now we're actually going to host our first poll. So you have 30 minutes to complete this. These are just very straightforward questions, just yes and no answers. 30 seconds.
Polling will end in 10 seconds. There are the results.
Okay, so what we're seeing here is that a little bit over half percent of our participants are participating in this webinar on behalf of an organization. And it looks like 61% of our participants have previously taken a seminar or a workshop on gender inclusivity. So that means that 40% of our participants have not done that.
We
So
have
what
now.
topics- Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's okay, no worries. We have included different sections in this guide and have designed it in an interactive way so that it could be more accessible to everyone. As you can see, our guide contains definitions, contextual information, and recommendations for leading practices. We will answer questions such as, why does gender inclusivity concern all of us? How exclusion, discrimination, and harassment impacts every individual in society, men, women, LGBTQ communities, etc. How multiple factors contribute to exclusionary practices, for example, race, age, disability, status, etc. What we can do differently, for instance, regarding policy, training, and accountability. How can we all foster inclusivity? We've also included some exercises in our guide and a glossary of terms section. We'll come back to this table at the end of this webinar to show how this resource can be used in your organization to facilitate discussions and changes towards better inclusionary practices. In order to understand what gender inclusivity is, we need to learn what we mean by gender. While sex of an individual is based on biological factors, their gender identity can be completely different. It is therefore important to note that when we discuss gender, we traditionally look at men and women as categories, but we're not necessarily indicating individuals' gender identity. In 2015, the United Nations released the Gender Statistics Manual, offering some guidelines on how we can study and measure data in a non-gendered manner, since isolating women's concerns from mainstream development policies and strategies limits the impact of such interrelationships. In this way, this document differentiates between the terms sex and gender by suggesting that the statistics should reflect diversity of women and men, and also be aware of social and cultural biases. So when we're talking of gender inclusivity, we're moving beyond the difference based on sex, and we're looking at how a person expresses their gender. Inclusivity then means to be open to everyone and not limited to certain people. From a gender standpoint, this means that services, establishments, learning institutions, government agencies are all welcoming of any individual's expression of their gender identity, including their characteristics and behaviors such as appearance, dress, mannerisms, speech patterns, and social interactions. The other important point that we would like to emphasize in this guide is that gender inclusivity is not, as some may assume, about a fraction of the population. It is not about minorities and women only, and involves all of us and should be accessible to everyone. At the same time, gender inclusivity is also not intended to blame men or to give a specific privileges to one group of individuals only. One question that, oh, yes, sorry, my bad, yeah.
So this is when we are doing the second poll. So again, you will have 30 seconds to answer the questions. They're very straightforward. And after you have completed the questions, we will just quickly discuss the results. So please go ahead and answer the question.
Poll will end in 5 seconds. Here are the results.
Okay, thank you very much. So the first question is, are you aware of any policies relating to inclusion, discrimination, or harassment in the context of gender in your organization? So 80% of our participants said yes, which is very encouraging. However, there are still 20% of our participants who are not aware of any policies. And have you ever received any gender inclusivity training in your organization? 59% of our participants said no, they have never received any training in their organizations, but 41% of our participants said yes, we have. So I'm just going to close this poll and then move on to our next slide. Just one moment, please.
All right, thanks everyone. One question that may arise is whether gender expression is the only identity marker that affects the individual in their workplace. As can be seen from the flower power on the slide, there are multiple factors that can affect a person's identity, such as sex, gender, ethnicity, or race, or even economic status. That is often called an intersectional analysis. There are many different forms of this chart, such as the one developed by the government's gender-based analysis platform, which are all based on the idea that our identity is often affected by several factors at the same time. While factors such as race and physical ability could play a more determining role in an individual's life in the workplace, other factors such as nationality or marital status could also affect their access to resources. In order to have a better understanding of how sex and gender affect inclusivity in the workplace, it is helpful to learn about intersectionality and how it affects gender inclusivity. In our resource guide, we are providing examples and statistics to illustrate how these factors, in addition to gender, can affect an individual's experience in the workplace. Right, sorry for the issue that we've been having with the screen. So the slides should be accessible now to you.
Slides are back.
Now let's take a look at how gender, in addition to other factors, can affect an individual's experience in the workplace. For instance, in this guide, we have included topics such as toxic masculinity, which harms men as well as women in our communities. Research suggests that traditional views of masculinity often involve violent behaviors that makes men the victims and the perpetrators in criminal acts by up to 90%. In addition, as discussed in the previous slide, other factors, such as a person's gender or sexual identity, can considerably change their experience in the workplace. I'm just showing this flower power image one more time. It is again included in our guide, but just because of the difficulty we've been having, for you to take a look at the different identity markers. While non-binary groups experience differently based on their sex and gender, they could also be subject to other forms of discrimination based on their individual expressions. For instance, a woman who does not conform to traditionally accepted feminine norms, while also being affected by their citizenship status or education, could be subject to a greater degree of discrimination in the workplace. Whereas all individuals have their unique identities in different forms, it is often more costly for minority groups who may not identify with one of the traditional gender groups. For example, non-binary individuals who are part of a specific ethnic minority may experience discrimination based on their gender from their own community and based on their ethnicity by other community members.
As gender is a significant identity marker for all of us, our daily experiences are shaped by it. The significance of gender in our daily lives cannot be overestimated. For example, lesbian and gay Canadians are twice as likely to suffer violent victimization, and 21% of trans students are verbally harassed. Immigrant and refugee women are more vulnerable to gender-based violence and face barriers in seeking support due to social isolation, lack of English skills, or underemployment, and uncertain legal status. Men are 3.5 times more likely than women to die of suicide, while they are also less likely to be diagnosed with depression, therefore receiving less support and treatment. 3,000 women in Canada live in a shelter on any given day to escape domestic violence. We can see that gender impacts all of us in different ways on a daily basis. It can affect our status, income, power, physical and emotional safety and well-being, our opportunities and choices, as well as personal freedoms and rights. What is gender-based violence? Gender-based violence affects some community groups more than others. For example, statistically, women or non-binary persons suffer a considerably higher degree of gender-based violence. From an employer's perspective, providing an environment free of discrimination and bullying will lead to an increased personal well-being and greater productivity for staff. It will help to attract diverse employees with unique skill sets, and it will set the company apart from competitors. What counts as discrimination and harassment? Discrimination is defined as any form of unequal treatment, such as by imposing extra burdens or denying benefits. It may be intentional or unintentional. It may involve direct actions that are discriminatory, or it may involve rules, practices, or procedures that appear neutral but disadvantage certain groups of people. The new definition by Human Rights Canada of discrimination. Discrimination is an action or a decision that treats a person or a group badly for reasons such as their race, age, or disability. These reasons, also called grounds, are protected under the Canadian Human Rights Act. Harassment means a course of comments or actions that are known or ought reasonably to be known to be unwelcome. It can involve words or actions that are known or should be known to be offensive, embarrassing, humiliating, demeaning, or unwelcome. So based on these definitions, discrimination could lead to behaviors that are forms of harassment, where at times discriminatory actions and harassment may overlap. The new definition of harassment by Human Rights Canada is that harassment is a form of discrimination. It includes any unwanted physical or verbal behavior that offends or humiliates you. Generally, harassment is a behavior that persists over time. Serious one-time incidents can also sometimes be considered harassment. Gender-based violence, in the form of harassment and discrimination, can take many forms: cyber, physical, sexual, societal, psychological, emotional, and economic, as well as neglect, and it can range from something as seemingly minor as jokes to comments, verbal assaults, intimidation, and bullying, to unwanted physical contact. While some of the forms of violence are easy to identify, others may be less obvious but nevertheless cause an individual to feel uncomfortable and unsafe. Some form of gender-based violence may take the form of denying to address somebody with the preferred name or pronoun, or could involve comments about somebody's appearance. So this is now where we are hosting the third poll. Again, it's just a couple of questions. It should only take about 30 seconds again for you to answer them. So if you could please host the third poll. Thank you. So please answer the poll, and then once everybody has submitted their answers, we will quickly go over the results again.
Five more seconds. There are the results.
Okay, thank you so much. So our first question, have you ever contacted management or HR to learn more about gender inclusivity practices and policies? So only 13% of our participants have said yes, while 87% have said no. And 65% of our participants have experienced discrimination in the workplace. Thank you, everyone. We have provided the definitions of harassment and discrimination. In order to expect a more inclusive community, we first need to make sure that staff receive training and information to understand discrimination and harassment. By providing training and information to all employees, staff will be able to understand different forms of discrimination and can be expected to create and maintain a safe and respectful environment for everyone. In such an environment, the staff can monitor their behavior and interactions and prevent conflicts. In addition, it is also important that staff are aware of clear procedures for reporting.
Now that we have defined the concepts and introduced some forms of this issue, the next slides will introduce the sections of the guide that focus on ways to prevent discrimination and harassment in the workplace and how we can deal with these issues when they arise in the workplace. In our resource, we focus on two different groups of employees in an organization: leadership and staff. The role of the leadership is vital in order to generate organizational changes, such as training, but also in order to provide direction. At the same time, inclusionary practices in an organization are not only a concern of management, but all staff. They should be aware in which ways they can contribute and make sure to educate themselves, follow the guidelines, and hold themselves accountable. Making policies and incorporating them in the everyday life of the employees is an important first step to have a more inclusive community. The leadership should make sure that all employees are aware of what counts as discrimination and harassment and what the guidelines are. While gender inclusivity in the workplace concerns everyone in the organization, there are different levels of capacity and decision-making in terms of the role of the individual. It is therefore important to differentiate between steps which managers and leaders can take within an organization and in which ways staff can foster a more inclusive environment. On a leadership level, gender inclusivity starts with developing and implementing clearly defined policies and practice guidelines which establish how an organization ensures that any form of discrimination or harassment will be addressed. This policy should also include review processes of the policy, such as how often and by whom it will be reviewed. Moreover, the offenses need to be outlined through training workshops. Training should be offered to all new staff, and existing staff should have refreshers. In order to ensure that both the policy and training are effective, it is vital to conduct staff evaluations. An accountable leadership will inevitably establish a more inclusive environment where they are responsible to keep the workplace a safe and respectful space and hold everyone responsible for inclusive interpersonal relations in the workplace.
Recommendations for all staff toward having a more inclusive workplace include the use of gender-neutral language, such as saying, "Good evening, everybody," instead of saying, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," or to ask an individual which pronouns they prefer. On a similar note, employees can all add their pronouns to their email signature as a way to embrace gender-neutral language. In addition, all forms, records, job postings, etc. should include a gender-neutral option. Dress code can present a particular problem for non-binary people, as they are frequently gendered with different clothing sets for men and women. In order to establish an inclusive dress code, it is important to focus on its purpose, that it should be professional and functional. For example, instead of focusing on suits for men and skirts for women, different set options could be included, such as set 1 includes a skirt and set 2 includes a suit. Allowing this kind of flexibility incorporates everyone's needs while still meeting the objectives of a dress code. Public bathrooms are commonly gendered, providing options for men and women. Neither are aimed at non-binary people, and both can be unsafe. A gender-neutral bathroom is one with no gendered signage or segregation. Gender-neutral bathrooms are for all staff, and we do not recommend creating another bathroom for non-binary people. Instead, non-binary people should be able to use a bathroom of their choice. Staff networks and resources can be particularly helpful to create a more supportive and inclusive environment. It is important to base this change on the level of knowledge currently in the organization. If you do have non-binary people in your organization, it is important to let them lead the change, both in the structure and in activities the network runs. This will help get non-binary people involved and will give you a better quality network in the end. Regular dialogues with staff about respecting differences and a supportive environment which encourages employees to meet and support each other can contribute to a more inclusive environment. As you can see from the table of content of our resource, we have structured our guide to provide basic information such as definitions to specific examples of how leadership and staff can both create a more inclusive environment, to exercises and a glossary. The guide has interactive features such as definitions which appear when you hover over a specific keyword. We hope that this guide can facilitate a discussion in your organization around which changes could be implemented and which steps are necessary to ensure that the change will take tangible shape.
In this webinar, we discussed why we developed this resource and why the topic of gender inclusivity is important, not only in the workplace, but in everyday life. We provided definitions of key terms such as sex versus gender, discrimination and harassment, and gender-based violence. Furthermore, we addressed different ways in which leadership and staff can contribute to a more inclusive workplace. Finally, we hope that this guide will be a useful tool to help you consider and implement changes in your organization.
So we now have 15 minutes available for question and answers. So please feel free to post any questions or comments that you have with respect to our presentation or our gender inclusivity tool. Also, we will like to ask you to fill out a short anonymous feedback form, which will really greatly help us with further developing this project in the future. So on the next slide, you will then receive access to the feedback form, and we would be very grateful if you could take the time to complete it. Thank you.
Yes, as you can see on the slide, the link would be provided to you, the link to the feedback form in the chat box. It will be posted there. So feel free to just fill that out or have that open in your browser maybe after the Q&A session. Thank you.
Before we go further, I also wanted to say, well, first of all, thank you everyone for your patience with the audio quality. We will share the recording with some closed captions, so you guys will have the access to that recording at a later date. We'll make sure you get that link or access to that. And perhaps I had a question coming through the chat. From Marcy. Does ability mean ability on the job or disability? Disability needs to be a marker, in my opinion. Mansure or Miriam, you want to answer? Yeah.
Thank you so much for the question. So when we are talking about ability and disability, they actually come as different sides, two sides of the same issue. So the idea is that any sort of mental or physical disability should not, in a way, put an individual in disadvantage when it comes to hiring practices, when it comes to accessing resources in the workplace, when it comes to the working spaces, the spaces that are shared with everyone. They should be able to access all those spaces, resources, and opportunities. So the fact that someone's ability is different or someone is experiencing disability should not cause them to not be able to use the services as the other individuals are able to use them. So in a way, these two are different sides of, as I mentioned, the same issue, and ability should not give someone, physical ability or mental ability should not give someone an advantage over any other specific group. And again, the flower power that we're looking at, there are many different versions of this. This one was interesting to us because it includes a lot of different issues that would be even a social issue that you're experiencing. And so it helps inclusive practices as we are observant and as we're trying to consider all the needs of our staff and our employees.
Awesome. Also have another question. I think you might have covered, but when you talk about gender, are you just talking about male, female? What about everyone else?
Mm-hmm. That is a great question. To some extent we did, but maybe very briefly throughout the webinar. So what the United Nations, as well as many other human rights commissions advise us, is that although we think of female and male as the sort of biological factor that we try to think of different individuals in a way, it does not necessarily determine their gender expression, right? So someone as, for example, someone who is female would identify in a way with a different gender identity, right? Everyone could be in a way could express their gender identity differently. And so again, when we come to sexual orientation, I would say that that adds another layer, right? So someone who is female and who identifies as a woman does not necessarily has a similar sexual orientation. So they may identify as a homosexual when it comes to sexual identity. And then the other factors, of course, as we went over them briefly, such as age, race, ethnicity, language, citizenship, all those factors could contribute in a way to the marginalization or to the discriminatory experiences that you may have in the workplace. Anything you want to add, Miriam?
I think you covered it quite well. Yes. Thank you, Anthony.
Thanks. Yeah.
I think I have another, just a comment also to from a participant on GPA plus. The person is talking about the struggle with GPA plus as a woman of color for personal experience haven't necessarily been on the basis of gender but race. This work's been challenging as he focuses on an area that doesn't represent his or her current reality. So any comments on GPA plus? And I agree. I'm on the same page as well. It's a huge concept, and yeah, any tips?
Absolutely. And so what I can speak to regarding, well, I'm sure there are people who are experts in the subject and can provide much better guidance than I can. But in my position, as far as I know about the practice, this is a practice that I think has helped a lot of the governmental organizations, a lot of the different ministries, to be able to come up with frameworks that could help with making policies, could help with, in a way, the practices that that are being implemented in organizations. In Alberta, we have had this framework in the past 4 to 5 years, as much as I'm aware of, and so I am sure that everyone's hope is for better opportunities and better chance to be able to apply that to other organizations, whether it's corporations, whether it's nonprofits, to have a sort of a unified guideline for that. And our purpose, in a way, our main objective in developing this resource, as we mentioned, was the fact that we want to have to provide a space that it becomes easier for individuals coming from background to know about these issues, right? So when we're talking about gender versus sex, when we're talking about inclusivity practices, how we can actually maintain that in the workplace, and also about discrimination and harassment, it's something that we would be able to know and to recognize, and hopefully to make us feel more encouraged to reach out to human resources, to people, to the management, to people who are responsible to, first of all, establish these policies and guidelines, right? For us to be able to know what they mean, what rights do we have regarding these issues, and how we can address a lot of these problems that may arise in the workplace. I know that a lot of people experience discrimination even when it comes to hiring practices that way, right? And so what could happen, and our hope is that people are more curious about these questions, right? So as I was looking at the polls, it sort of told me that a lot of people do not really want to, even if they need to at times, to contact the HR or human resources, right? And it's because it could go many different ways. And there are legal aspects, there are interpersonal relationships. People do not want to basically jeopardize their professional status, their works, and so on. And so that's why the role of the management and leadership is so important. And that is what we have tried to highlight in our resource, to show what practical steps the management specifically can take in order to educate staff, in order to introduce these guidelines, and in order to even, launch training programs, workshops, and so on, in order to be accountable, first of all, as the management, as the leadership, and at the same time support them in learning more about that, to be more curious about that, to report, whereas we know a lot of these incidents go usually unreported in the workplace, again, because of a lot of those different issues. So the goal should be to make this whole thing accessible. And so we have tried to, in a way, highlight that role more in our resource. And we're hoping that we can get a chance to expand on this pilot project and to include more aspects and more practical steps, or more, in a way, in person, even at times, workshops to work on these issues more together.
Yeah, and if I
Miriam,
could,
if you want.
yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
If I could perhaps add to this, one of the things that we did notice when we were reviewing current publications and guides for gender inclusivity, very often they are fairly abstract. And in our interpretation, gender inclusivity is really something that needs to be practiced every day and by everyone. And it's not just something where managers can ask their employees to watch this online video or this online presentation, and then they're good to go, because now they can check this box that, oh, their staff has done this. To us, it's really more about changing the culture and also being very clear about what is the responsibility of the leadership, but also what can the average staff in an organization do, because otherwise it's also very easy to just say, well, but this is way beyond me, I don't write policy, so what can I possibly do? So we really try to incorporate and address everyone in this guide, and also at the same time to make it very tangible and very accessible for everyone. So we didn't want it to have something that is very text heavy. We didn't want to have yet another sort of talking around the issues of gender inclusivity document, but that doesn't really address specific steps that can be taken. So that was our intent really behind what very much informed us how we developed this guide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Awesome. We have one more question and maybe we can wrap up. Is that okay for you? Okay.
I think so. Yeah, I think we have a few, like 3-4 minutes. Maybe.
So this is a big question. What are the historical roots of discriminatory social norms, and how can we sensitively address them in a way that nurtures safer and more inclusive work environments?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. This is a very big, it opens a lot of, it could open a lot of discussions in a way that unfortunately we may not have the space for. But when we look at communities and individuals, just to go back to my own work in a way, my own research, what happens is that when it comes to difference, right, we have been socialized in a way to some extent to recognize those differences, right? And at times, historically, we have been trying to protect ourselves based on those differences. So whereas, for example, there is a sexual difference between these two individuals, or there's a social difference in a way, there is a difference in the way they practice things, right? So there have been a lot of those issues, of course, historically, and there are a lot better experts who could speak to that. I'm sure there are a lot of really good resources available on the topic. But what happens is that we should recognize these biases that we all have, right? Regardless of what gender, what race, ethnicity we come from, regardless of what language we speak, regardless of our own personal experiences, right? We have these biases. And so one of the things that we usually encourage people to do is to, especially when it comes to organizations and workplaces, to run and ask these centers that offer the workshops and these sessions to show them about unconscious biases, right? That the biases that we all have, but we are, for many different reasons, we are unconscious of them, but it shows up when we are practicing, when we are doing something in the workplace, when we're working with people coming from different backgrounds, and it impacts our decision making, it impacts our behavior. So unconscious bias is something that I think should be an indispensable part of training when it comes to human resources and organizations. But again, there is a lot to be said there. This is just a few things that food for thought, basically, the whole webinar, and to make you more interested and in a way, make you more encouraged to access the resource.
Awesome. Thank you, Mansur. I just have one more, and I don't think we have time, but Lori's questions, I'm copying the questions, and hopefully you two can really get back to answer. Very valuable question I'm seeing. So, but I am conscious of time, and it's almost 2 o'clock. So we'll make sure to get a copy of this recording and transcript. And we'll reach out to attendees to access that. So Mansur, Miriam, thank you so much. Do you have any last comments for everybody?
Yeah, we just want to thank everyone for your interest in our gender inclusivity tool, for taking the time to participate in the webinar today. Please feel free to email us if you have any questions or concerns or suggestions. We would be very happy to hear from you. After this webinar, we will also share our resource with you. And also, if you have any additional feedback for us on this webinar, how we can improve it aside from the audio and the slide issues, we will definitely take that to heart. And yeah, thank you all so much for your time, and we wish you all a really lovely and wonderful and safe rest of the day. Please stay in touch.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, your feedback matters a lot, so I would encourage you to please fill out the form. It would probably take only a few minutes, but it would help us greatly in developing this resource and the future programs and projects. Thank you so much for tuning in. Have a great evening. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for sticking around. Have a safe week. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.